Welcome to Good Medicine, a podcast about the people, ideas, and absurd complexities shaping the future of healthcare. I'm your host, Dr. Rohan Ramakrishna, a neurosurgeon and co-founder of Room, and someone who has spent a lot of time inside healthcare thinking, this is incredible, this is broken, and somehow both of these things are true at once. Good Medicine is brought to you by Room, the digital home for doctors. It's a free, physicians-only community where doctors can connect, share knowledge, and help shape the future of medicine. You can join at room.com. Today, I got to sit down with Dr. Anthony Fauci, which still sounds pretty surreal to say. Think about it. He's basically been in the room for every major public health crisis over the last several decades. HIV, AIDS, COVID, Ebola, you name it. He ran NIAID for decades, advised 7 presidents, and yet remarkably, his story starts in a very humble way, working in the aisles of his family's Brooklyn pharmacy. What I loved about this conversation was that it wasn't just a staid conversation about Dr. Fauci, the public figure. It was really about the arc of his life in medicine and public service, how a kid from Brooklyn ends up in the Situation Room, helping shape decisions that affect millions of people. We talked about PEPFAR, which is the most successful global health program in history, and the wild behind-the-scenes story of how it all came together, including a Godfather-style meeting in, of all places, Bethesda, Maryland. A few things really stuck with me. One was this idea of the amplifying effect. Dr. Fauci loved taking care of patients one-on-one, but he realized that through his research and public health, he could help not just one person, but millions of people all at the same time. We also talked about his relationship with the HIV/AIDS activist community, especially Larry Kramer, who was famously antagonistic towards him early on. But instead of dismissing the activists, Dr. Fauci listened, and that ended up changing the way that clinical trials are done in America, bringing patients and communities into the center of the process. And of course, we talked about COVID, the politics, the anger, the threats, the way that science itself became the battlefield. What came through was his belief that if you're a public health official, the entire public is your patient. And sometimes that means telling people the truth, even when they really, really don't want to hear it. Dr. Fauci brings this mix of scientific seriousness, Brooklyn grit, and a lifetime of actionable wisdom. I think you'll really enjoy this one. Join us for the conversation. Today, I'm so thrilled and excited and honored to be joined by Dr. Anthony Fauci, the former leader of NIAID and who led and shaped our COVID response to the benefit of all of us Americans and indeed citizens throughout the globe. Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
You know, I want to start kind of at the beginning. I'm in New York City. In fact, one of my offices is in Brooklyn, not far from Bensonhurst, where you grew up. So I'm curious, how did you first decide on a career in medicine?
Well, you know, Ron, I think it relates back to my family upbringing. My father, together with my mother, operated in Brooklyn, in a working class section of Brooklyn, sort of a mom and pop version of a pharmacy. My father was a pharmacist. He went to Columbia College of Pharmacy and practiced pharmacy in the neighborhood. And back then, unlike the industrial pharmacies of today, the pharmacist, and this was in the 1940s and 1950s, was kind of like the neighborhood doctor for the common people. He was simultaneously would fill prescriptions, but he was also a marriage counselor, a psychiatrist, you know, a comforter of people who've had illness in the family or delinquent children or what have you. So right from the very beginning, I worked with my family. I used to deliver prescriptions on my Schwinn bike riding around the neighborhood. I got the feeling of the important thing in life for my family was service to others. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that. And to be honest with you, I don't even think I consciously processed that in my mind at the time because I was only 8, 9, 10 years old. But then in my training educationally, I had the fortune of, I went to elementary school at a Catholic school in Bensonhurst, Our Lady of Guadalupe, right on 73rd Street and 16th Avenue. But I went to Regis High School in Manhattan, which was a Jesuit school, and the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Mass, which was also a Jesuit school. And the theme of the schools was always service to others. So I kind of felt like I wanted to do things with people. I also simultaneously found out in high school that I really liked science. I liked biology. I liked chemistry. So I was trying to figure out, with the help of some Jesuit mentors, what's the best thing to combine my real need to be interacting with people and to be caring for people, not just interacting with them, together with the fact that I really liked and was pretty good at science. So it seemed to me that medicine was the absolute natural thing for me to do. And I wound up going to medical school at Cornell.
Yeah. But one other thing I noticed is that you really spent a lot of time studying the classics, right? And so I'm curious, are there any particular texts or ideas that you've returned to throughout your career?
Well, it's interesting when you say study the classics. I mean, I really studied the classics. In the Jesuit high school, I took 4 years of Greek and 4 years of Latin and 3 years of a Romance language. In this case, it was French. I did the same thing at Holy Cross. I had a very unusual curriculum at Holy Cross, which almost seems like inherently contradictory. My degree, Rohan, was Bachelor of Arts dash classics/philosophy dash pre-med.
Yeah.
So I took all the classics and enough science to fulfill the requirements to get into medical school. But in direct answer to your question, one of the things that has stuck with me through all of the many hours and semesters that I spent in the classics was, the Greek classic saga of the Odyssey, was really replete with resiliency, endurance, and integrity. It's a very long book. We translated it from Greek to English and we read it in English. But the critical issue in that was, Odysseus in the Odyssey, who was, trying to return home from wars in different countries. And there was always some obstacle to where he was going to get. But because of his high degree of resiliency and durability and mostly integrity, he got to where he was going. So every once in a while, if you want to fantasize who you want to be on that boat with Odysseus.
Yes, I think that's great. I was actually also a philosophy major, so what you said really speaks to me. I'm curious, as you were finishing residency, you could have gone a number of different ways, conventional academic medical center into, clinical practice entirely, but you went to the NIH. So what made you decide to do that?
That is the question that I think is the pivotal question in the direction of my career. And when I talk to students and house staff, interns and residents who come to me today and ask that same question because they're in the same boat that I was in, I tell them a story that surprises them. When I graduated medical school at Cornell, I took an internship, a couple of years of residency, and I wanted to take a fellowship in infectious diseases, which was, a combination back then. They were just learning the kind of rudimentary human immunology and the interface between immunology. My total purpose, I was convinced, was to take the fellowship, come back to Cornell, do a chief residency, get on the staff at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. And I was so differentiated, I knew I wanted to have my office on 71st Street and York Avenue. I mean, that's what I absolutely wanted to do. But everything changed when I went to the NIH. I became enamored of this concept that as much as I loved taking care of patients and clinical medicine and all the excitement and the gratification of clinical medicine, there was something about this amplifying effect that if you do research and develop a protocol or make a discovery, that can have an amplifying effect where you can influence and positively impact more than just the individual patient that you happen to take care of. I felt that's what I wanted to do, as long as I kept my hands and feet in clinical medicine. So when I finished the fellowship, I went back to Cornell and became chief resident from 1971 to 72 in the Department of Medicine. But my mentor back at the NIH said, if you want to stay in New York and do what you said you really want to do, I love you, we'll still be friends. But if you really want to come back to the NIH, I'll have a position for you that's a permanent tenured senior position. So somewhere in the middle of my chief residency, I decided, as much as I love every single day doing nothing but patients, I wanted to combine patients with research. So I made what turned out to be a career-defining decision to come back to Bethesda, and I've been there ever since.
Yeah. When I was reading about your early career, I don't think many people, at least outside of infectious disease and immunology, know that, you started in vasculitides, right? And helped create all new therapies and induce remission in all those patients, which is amazing. But what did that process of learning and discovering about vasculitides and therapies and new treatments, how did that shape your work later in infectious disease?
Profoundly, Rohan. Let me explain why. Because it really proved to me what we often say when we speak to students, and that is the importance of the bench-to-bedside approach and the bedside-to-bench and bench-to-bedside, because I began taking care of very seriously ill individuals with vasculitic syndromes, what we used to call Wegener's granulomatosis, now is granulomatosis with polyangiitis and polyarteritis nodosa. And it was clear to me in a frustrating way that glucocorticoids alone, particularly with GPA, was like 100% mortality with those patients. So we had to figure out something different. But it was my being at the bedside and feeling that frustration of doing everything you can to help a patient to ultimately have them die of pulmonary hemorrhage or renal failure or what have you, which triggered my thoughts of maybe we could take a drug that is used in high doses in cancer, like cyclophosphamide, and give it in really lower doses to suppress the aberrant immune response and the autoimmune response of the vasculitides, enough to shut the disease off, but not enough to give them an immunocompromised state. So I learned that from the vasculitis. In 1981, when I start to see the first patients clinically with HIV, we didn't even know it was HIV because it was the summer of 1981 when I admitted the first patients to the NIH right after the first cases that were reported in MMWR. I was taking care of them myself physically. And that same model that I did when I was taking care of the patients with the vasculitides made me figure out, we've got to figure out what's going on with these patients. What is the pathogenic mechanism of this mysterious disease, which is likely a viral disease? And then when we found out, I didn't find the virus, others did, but once we identified the virus, then I started to do a whole bunch of studies of trying to figure out, what are the pathogenic mechanisms that this virus was using to destroy the body's immune system. So, bench to bedside with the vasculitides led to the bench to bedside and back with HIV.
Back then, I'm curious, when you first started taking care of patients with HIV, it wasn't even called HIV then, were they coming to you or to the NIH because it was a affliction affecting young men, otherwise unexplained? Or, how were they even getting to you back then?
Well, it was the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. My laboratory was the Laboratory of Immunoregulation. So you figured, this is the Infectious Disease Institute. One thing we did know, it was an infection because epidemiologically, it absolutely had to be an infection, even though we didn't know what the etiologic agent was. So we began essentially recruiting, saying, we understand there are these strange diseases in New York, LA, and San Francisco. We'd be very interested in taking care of and studying these patients. So right from the get-go, in the late summer, early fall of 1991, we started admitting patients. And it was really an unusual situation because we didn't know what the virus was until 1983, 1984. So for at least 2 full years, I was taking care of patients with an infectious diseases that we didn't know what it was, which is, kind of a unique experience in medicine to be taking care of somebody who has an infection, but you don't know what it is.
Two questions. When did you make the decision that you're going to pivot your career from sort of the vasculitides to HIV/AIDS? And when did you realize that HIV and AIDS would come to be the sort of focus for, another 10, 15, 20 years?
Well, what it was my perception, which unfortunately turned out to be accurate, that since this was a sexually transmitted disease, and the enormity of the problem, because the first 10, 15 patients that I saw were desperately ill. And we were putting Band-Aids on hemorrhages metaphorically. No matter what we did, we would treat one opportunistic infection and they would get another. We would treat that and then they would get a third and then they would die. So at that point, I said, there's no walking away from this. I really got to essentially hand over my responsibilities for my large cohort of patients with the vasculitides, which I had been following now. This was 1981, so I was doing that for at least 10 years. Because I started seeing them before my chief residency, and my chief residency was 71 to 72, so now it's 81, so it's almost 10 years. I handed over the patients and said, now I'm going to do full-time on this new disease. And interestingly, this new disease, at the time I made that decision, still didn't have a name yet. We were calling it GRID, for gay-related immunodeficiency, which is now, when you think about it, a completely inappropriate terminology for it. But it was at that point when I recognized the enormity of the problem. And then the thing that nailed it for me, I had already made the decision to very actively study it. When the HIV test, the ELISA, was made available in 1985, we did screening tests on people at high risk in New York City, in Greenwich Village, and in the Castro district of San Francisco. And it just completely floored me. At the time, we're talking now 1985, of the men that we screened in the Castro district and in New York, up to 40% of them were already infected. That was a horrifying realization, because when we realized that, we didn't even have AZT yet. We had no therapies. So that was a very sobering experience, which completely nailed down for me, this is what I have to devote all of my time to.
As you, and we'll talk more about HIV/AIDS in your work there, but as you were at NIAID, you became the leader of it. And so much of becoming a leader of something is talent and discipline and hard work and sometimes serendipity. So I'm curious, what were the key moments of timing, luck, serendipity that kind of led to that elevation for you?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I did not want to do the job. I was fundamentally a physician scientist who spent a lot of time on the ward seeing patients, but ran a lab that was doing some pretty good work dissecting out the immunopathogenesis of HIV. But at the time, the NIAID, my institute, was really like a sleepy institute in the sense of infectious disease was relegated to a very low level. We have vaccines, we have antibiotics, so no big deal. Like, of the not even 12 institutes at the time, we're talking 1984, the NIAID was like the 6th or 7th largest. We had a budget of like $350 million. When I left in 2022, it was $6.2 billion. So I just felt that we were not doing enough for infectious diseases in general, and we certainly were not doing enough for HIV/AIDS. So I figured, as much as I never saw myself as a science administrator, I decided I would take on another hat, which has some important implications, because I didn't want to give up, and I didn't give up seeing patients, and I didn't give up the lab, but I also took on the awesome responsibility of running the institute. And the director of the institution at the time, the director of NIH and the secretary of HHS, were very, very kind to me and said, we will allow you to do that, to see patients and to continue to run your lab, so long as you remember that your primary responsibility is to run the institute. And we trust you to do that. So I did. But what it did, it turned my day into an 18-hour day.
Yes. And from there, you've gone on to advise 7 U.S. presidents over your career. And I'm curious, as you've been in that position of influencing, the most powerful people on earth, what's been the most surprising or memorable experiences? I've seen photos of you presenting in the Oval Office, you've been in the Situation Room. What stands out to you as the most memorable from those times?
It's very interesting. It's a very strange feeling. The White House is an unusual place. When you go into it for the first time, you're struck with awe. You go into the Oval Office, you go into the Situation Room, you say, this is where Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided he was going to do the New Deal. And this is where Abraham Lincoln decided we were going to go to war in the Civil War. So it's like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. But then when you go there every day, up to the time of the Trump administration, I would go there intermittently and, maybe 10, 15 times a year, sit down in the Situation Room with Obama and with Clinton and with George W. Bush, et cetera. But the most amazing, memorable thing now, 3 years out of that, is that even though you get used to it and you're comfortable sitting there in front of the Resolute desk talking to the president, you still have a feeling of awe every time you go in the building. So it's kind of this almost inherently contradictory feeling of, oh, I'm really used to it. But every time you go in, you get this feeling of majesty and awe that you're in the place where so many important historic things occurred.
Yeah.
The most memorable incident there is when President George W. Bush commissioned me to go ahead and put together a program for Africa to get treatment and prevention for HIV in Africa. And I did that, and that turned out to be the PEPFAR program, which we decided to call PEPFAR. So that is the specific thing that if I have to pick out one thing, was when he called me into the White House and said, we really have to do something what's going on in Africa with HIV. So why don't you go there and come back and tell me if you think that there's something we can do? And I did. And that maybe turned out to be one of the most important things that I've done in my career.
Yeah, would you agree it's probably the most spectacularly successful public health intervention in history?
Oh, it is. There's no doubt about it.
No.
When I proposed it to the president, I went to Africa and I tried to do multiple different scenarios, how many countries, how much on prevention, how much on treatment, et cetera. I came back and said, I know we can do it, but it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost $15 billion over 5 years is what I proposed, to treat 2 million people, prevent 7 million infections. And to his great credit, he said, go ahead and put the program together. We'll do it. Fast forward 23 years, because we did it in 2002 and 2003. Fast forward 23 years to 2026, that program has now saved about 26 million lives. So unquestionably, without even anything being close, it's the most impactful global public health program of any disease ever. As I often say when I talk about it, I was one of the instruments to put it together, but it would not have happened had it not been for George W. Bush saying, we've got to do this. In fact, I wrote down his words immediately after leaving the White House when he told me, he said, as a rich country, I feel, and he said, me, George Bush, feel that we have a moral obligation not to allow people to suffer and die from a preventable and treatable disease merely because of where they happen to have been born. So let's see what we can do about it. It's very interesting,
Where's that mentality today?
Well, I was just going to say, contrast that with what's going on today is a dramatic turnaround from that.
Yeah. Now, I read somewhere, now correct me if I'm wrong, was his dad also interested in this?
His father, who, as I describe in my memoir, when I told little vignettes about each of the presidents, I never tell you which one I like more because that's too political. But George H.W. Bush was the consummate gentleman, a wonderful man. And I think it's an example of whether you're conservative or liberal or progressive, you still can be a really good human being. It doesn't matter what your political ideology is. So I first interacted with George H.W. Bush in an interesting situation because Ronald Reagan, with all of his good qualities, did not use the bully pulpit of the presidency as effectively as he could when it came to HIV. He was elected in 1980 and inaugurated in 1981. 6 months later were the first reported cases of AIDS in the summer of 81, but he didn't mention the word AIDS until the second year of his second term. So he really lost the opportunity of encouraging the country to pay attention to this and giving resources. But when George H.W. Bush, who was vice president, decided that he was going to run for president, he invited himself to the NIH to visit me because I was a very visible person in the 1980s studying HIV. And he really wanted to learn about it and said, this is an important disease. Tell me about it. So that was sort of the beginning of the interest in HIV on the part of administrations. He boosted the budget up a fair amount. I mean, as the activists say, he maybe could have done more, but he was the one that really turned it around and said, this is something we need to pay attention to.
In your book, I also love the occasional sprinkling of Godfather quotes. Do you have a favorite Godfather quote?
Yeah, it's when people ask me how I can handle all these kinds of criticisms, and I just say, it's nothing personal. It's strictly business.
Mine is leave the gun, take the cannoli.
Yeah, that was good.
You also talk about kind of a secret meeting in Bethesda, Godfather style, in the lead up to getting PEPFAR briefed and worked on. Can you talk about that meeting?
Yeah, well, I mentioned just a moment ago, Rohan, that President Bush told me to go ahead and commissioned me to put together this program, but he did not want anybody to know about it because he was afraid that if it became public what I was doing, that everybody would want to have their own little version of things and to become typical Washington politicized. Like this congressman would want to do that and that senator. So he said, I'm giving you my permission to go and put together a program to present to me, but you can't tell anybody what it is, not even the director of NIH, not even the secretary of HHS, which made me very uncomfortable because, these are people that I reported to in the hierarchy of the government. So when I finally got the program and presented it to Josh Bolton, who was his chief of staff, a great guy, the OMB, who handles the money, heard about what I was proposing, and they were pushing back because they thought it would be too expensive. So it's interesting, you have the president telling me to put together a program and present to him. And as I'm getting ready to present to him, you have OMB saying, this is really troublesome. This is a lot too much money in a restricted budget. So they said to me, here's what you have to do. You're a white guy in a suit telling us that we need to spend billions of dollars. How do I know you know what you're talking about? Why don't you get together 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever people who are actually in the field globally, and I want you to bring them to Washington, to OMB, to have them convince us that what you're saying is true, that A, we need this, and B, it's feasible. But you can't really tell anybody about this, but I want you to bring them to Washington. So, okay, so I thought, who do I know? So Paul Farmer, a good friend of mine, was in Haiti. Eric Gooseby, another good friend of mine, was in Rwanda. Magunyu, who was the guy who was in Uganda, came by, and they all came to the restaurant in Bethesda. But I didn't want anybody to know they were there because I wasn't supposed to coach them into what they were supposed to tell O and B. So I decided, let's meet in a really small Italian restaurant in the middle of Bethesda. The thing I describe in my memoir is that when I walked into the restaurant, there was nobody else, maybe one other table that was occupied. And there were these 4 guys coming from all over the world to meet with me, and my going in the restaurant to prep them on what they should be telling O and B. And the only thing I could think of was the scene when Michael Corleone walked into the restaurant in The Godfather and shot Soloso the Turk and the police captain.
Right.
But as I said in the memoir, this turned out to be a much more favorable meeting.
Is that restaurant still there?
It is.
Do they know about their importance in the history of public health?
I didn't tell them about it.
So given the current funding uncertainty when it comes to PEPFAR, I mean, I think it's in the budget now, but there's a pause and all this other thing. What concerns you most about HIV/AIDS care in Africa and the program itself?
Well, it's no secret that the new administration, they have dramatically diminished, if not decimated, USAID. And about 60% or so of the funds that go to Southern Africa are channeled through USAID. The other thing is that the money for PEPFAR has been diminished somewhat, and the certainty of the authorization of PEPFAR, the way they would authorize it for a few years in a row, is somewhat tenuous. So the two vehicles, the funding vehicle of PEPFAR and the implementation vehicle of USAID have been dramatically diminished. And anybody who knows anything about HIV, if you have people who depend on their daily medication with HIV, you interrupt that in a period of several weeks to a month, they're going to rebound right back with their viral load, which is going to result in, people getting sick and dying. So I'm very worried that the tendency to pull away from our global commitments and our global collaborations, which has done a number of things for us as a nation. One, it's an amazing mechanism of soft power. I mean, if you go to Africa and you talk about the United States, the first thing that comes up is PEPFAR and what the United States has done for some of the countries in Southern Africa. The other thing is, it doesn't seem to be the situation currently now, but I do feel that as a rich country, we do sort of have an obligation, the way George W. Bush articulated it explicitly, that we have an obligation as a rich country to take a look and see that if there are things that we can do to help countries not suffer and die from a preventable and treatable disease, we should try and, not be a free lunch forever, but at least get them off their feet so that they can then handle it themselves. So I'm very concerned about the fact that we've pulled out of WHO. WHO is kind of the camera on the world to inform us what's going on. And we've damaged dramatically our ability to participate in the kind of activity that we've done with PEPFAR and USAID.
Can any other country or institution make up for the U.S. shortfall administratively, financially, or are we really the buck stops with us?
I don't want to make it seem that other countries are inadequate. They're not. They have great scientists. They have very good public health programs. But when it comes to resources and leadership at the global level, both scientifically and from a public health standpoint, although other countries and philanthropy can fill the gap somewhat, they never will be able to do it at the scale that we've done it, both in the investment, in the research that ultimately gets implemented in the developing world, but also in the actual public health programs like the President's Malaria Initiative, the PMI, responsible for saving countless lives of children, mostly infants in Africa. I already told you, and you knew before I even told you, about the fact that PEPFAR program over 23 years has saved about 26 million lives. There's no other country that can step to the plate to make that an equal effort. They can try, and it's very useful when they do it, but not to the scale that the United States has done.
I think it's important that Americans realize how proud they should be of a program like this, right? In their name, 26 million lives have been saved. How many babies have been saved? I think it's something as Americans, everyone should feel rightly proud of, to be helping in that way. So I hope that message is communicated.
Yeah, no, I think people who travel to those countries, it'll be obvious to them. Often when Americans go to countries, that movie from many years ago, The Ugly American, that foreign countries don't particularly like us. But when you go to those countries that are PEPFAR countries, they are very grateful for what we're doing for them.
One of the things that I think you also had incredible insight and experience with is with relation to patient advocacy groups and your famous relationship with Larry Kramer. I'm curious, why was there such antagonism at the beginning of that? Like, why did it start with antagonism and move to friendship rather than starting with friendship, let's say?
Rohan, it's a very important story because it has served, I think, as a model subsequently of how you deal with advocacy groups. So in the very early years of HIV, the scientific and clinical research community and the regulatory community were doing things that were time-honored and worked well for other diseases. You know that yourself. When you have a clinical protocol, there's very strict entry and exclusion criteria. You have to go through all the pristine ways of doing a clinical trial. There's no such a thing as getting a new drug that hasn't been approved outside of the clinical trial. We didn't have compassionate usage then. The other thing is that the FDA was understandably very slow and determined in their analysis of the data, and they would take maybe a couple of years to get something approved. And the gay community, led by the activists, was saying, wait a minute, we know that when we get admitted after we have clinically obvious disease, we have a life expectancy of 12 to 15 months. So do the math. We can't wait a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years for a drug. So they wanted to have a seat at the table to get the scientists and the regulatory community to at least listen to why HIV was so different and why they wanted input. Now, the scientific community, understandably but inexcusably, said, we know best for you because you're not a scientist, we're the scientists. We've got to do it right. We've got to do it in a pristine way. Otherwise, we won't get a clear-cut answer. The regulatory community says, we've done this way for decades. It's worked well. So the gay community said, yeah, I know, but we really want to be part of the process. So once they were excluded, then they became provocative, disruptive, theatrical, iconoclastic. And there was this tension between the activist community and us, the scientific community. As I say frequently when I talk about it, is that one of the best things that I've ever done in my professional career was, instead of doing what almost everybody in the scientific community did, was that when they started demonstrating, scientific community would run away from them and say, we don't want anything to do with them. The thing that I did, which, intuitively I did it, but retrospectively is one of the best things I did, instead of essentially distancing myself from the activist community, I embraced them. And I said, let me, instead of concentrating on the theatrics and the disruptive behavior, let me listen to what they're saying. And when I listened to what they were saying, they made absolutely perfect sense. And I actually said to myself, if I were in their shoes, I would be doing exactly what they're doing. And that's when we started to sit down finally and say, let me hear what you have to say. Now, we didn't all of a sudden become kumbaya in the first week. It took months of gaining trust with each other to the point that they went from adversaries to collaborators to partners to actually good friends.
Yeah.
And that's what evolved over a period of years. So it was, really a historic interaction that laid the framework for subsequent interaction between the scientific and regulatory community and the activist community.
How did you first meet Larry? Was it after his SF Examiner piece?
Yeah, he wanted to gain my attention, and he definitely gained my attention. For your audience, I did meet him very peripherally, but not interact with him when he was disrupting a meeting at HHS. And then when he wanted to really get on the scene and attract my attention, he's deceased now, an incredibly talented author, playwright, critic. He's an amazing guy, but a firebrand of all firebrands. So he wrote an article on the front page of the magazine section, I guess, of the San Francisco Examiner, saying, I call you a murderer, an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Yeah.
Which, you can imagine, you're sitting there reading this and I'm saying, is that what I went to Cornell Medical School for?
Yeah. Right.
But it turns out that he did something really important because he was very brute force about it. He was very critical, even though deep down he may not have felt that way. But what he did, he opened the door to the more intellectual, measured activists of the younger people in ACT UP. The people like Peter Staley and Greg Gonzalez and Mark Harrington and Jim Migo and people like that, and people like Marty Delaney in San Francisco. So he kind of broke the door down and they came in and started doing the really productive things.
You wrote somewhere that some of his behaviors were outrageous, back during that time. Is there a particular incident that stands out to you from that time that was actually strategically brilliant on his part to have done?
Yeah, he's done a lot of strategically brilliant things that I didn't think was strategically brilliant. At the time, we would get on television where he would be in New York and I would be in Washington, D.C., and we'd be talking on the Ted Koppel show. And he'd get there and he would be tearing me apart. You're this and you're that. And then after it, he would get the attention of everybody. And when I would go home, he'd call me up. He said, hey, Tony, that was really pretty good, wasn't that? In fact, it's very interesting, but there is a play that was downtown in NYU Theater called Kramer Fauci. And it was essentially a reenactment of that 1 hour phone conversation that we had with each other, in which he completely destroyed me at the same time that he loved me. It was really an interesting relationship.
How did engagement with the advocacy groups and activist groups change how clinical trials are operated, nationally at the NIH, how drug approvals might happen at the FDA?
Well, it changed it dramatically. It was a sea change because right now you cannot have a clinical trial group or any protocol group or any advisory council either to an NIH institute or the FDA without having community advocacy representatives. So it went from they're having to fight their way in to it's totally natural now. And I'm sure in your own field, you see the same thing. You have a advisory group. There's always someone who has a link to the community. That was not the natural thing to do until after HIV.
Well, that's great. It's so telling and important that is actually what ultimately is a great benefit, right? To have these advocacy groups influence clinical trials and drug approvals in that way. I'm curious, as you think about HIV now, what and like the possibility of a vaccine. What is the latest science there that you're excited about? Is there a vaccine in our future?
Well, that's a great question. And I wish I could say that we're definitely going to get a vaccine. And the answer is I don't know about that, because HIV is maybe the only disease in which the natural immune response to the virus is inadequate. Most any other infection, measles, smallpox, polio, even though a number of people suffer and some die, the majority of people recover from the infection and develop an immune response that protects them against subsequent exposure. That doesn't happen with HIV. Once you get infected, the body does not mount an adequate immune response. That doesn't mean we're not going to get a vaccine, because the standard way of getting a vaccine is to present to the body either the pathogen inactivated or attenuated, or more recently, some epitope that's the immunogen. That could be a spike protein, that could be an envelope protein, or what have you. That approach for the last almost 40 years has not worked. The new approach is to try and induce the B cell repertoire to make an immune response that not even natural infection readily induces. That's going to be very difficult, Rohan. It's not necessarily going to be impossible, but it's going to be difficult, because the paradigm of almost every other vaccine is to safely induce an immune response that natural infection does, because most people recover from natural infection. And once they get infected, they're generally protected against reinfection. That's not the case. But what we do have with HIV is that we now have long-acting antivirals that you can give by injection once every 6 weeks that have anywhere from a 96 to a 100% efficacy in preventing the acquisition of infection in someone who's not infected. Now, if you're asking what's the future is one, obviously, we want to get a vaccine. But the other future is to implement the amazing tools that we already have. Because if you get the people who are infected on antiretrovirals and get their virus to below detectable level, there have been countless studies to show that if you have an undetectable viral load, it's virtually impossible that you would transmit your infection to an uninfected person. It's called U equals U. Undetectable equals untransmittable. The other thing is, if you can identify all the people at risk for infection and get them on an injection every 6 months or a pill every day, you could prevent any acquisition of HIV. So we already have the tools scientifically. We would love to have a vaccine, but if we implemented the tools that we already have, we could shut the HIV epidemic off tomorrow.
And then based on PEPFAR, there's all the amazing work with the Clinton Foundation with lecanavir, right?
Absolutely.
So that could be an amazing way to execute on what you just said.
Yeah.
So I want to switch to COVID next. A highlight of your career, maybe that's a wrong word, I don't but I'm curious, how quickly did it become apparent that mRNA technology was going to be the right platform to potentially bet on?
We knew pretty quickly, just on the nature of the adaptability of how quickly you could get a sequence of a virus. And in this case, the whole sequence of COVID was made in a public database about January 10th of 2020. So unlike prior vaccine development, where you would have to grow up the virus and inactivate it, et cetera, all you needed to do was pull out the sequence of the spike protein, stick it into the mRNA platform, and within days, literally days, not months and years, but days, we started working on the development of the mRNA with Moderna and Pfizer. So speed from the time you identify the pathogen, that was the first thing. The second thing was the flexibility and adaptability of the mRNA, so that when we went from the original wild type Wuhan strain to the alpha variant, beta, delta, and then Omicron in November of 2021, and ever since then, we've had multiple versions and subgroups of Omicron. No other type of platform technology would have been able to get us to adapt to the moving target. So I would say that right from the beginning, the speed told us that this was going to be the way to go. And the fact that we needed to adapt to the changing of the variants made it absolutely obvious that that was the best approach.
What do you see as the most important lessons from Operation Warp Speed in terms of the future of public health pandemic preparedness?
Well, it's a simple lesson, is that when you get a massive amount of resources that are targeted to a devastating public health problem, and you have collaboration in its best form between the public and private sector, in this case, the pharmaceutical companies, and all of the agencies that are relevant to this of the federal government, the NIH, the FDA, the CDC, you can do amazing things. So what Operation Warp Speed did, it took the science that the NIH, my institute, NIAID, funded, both on platform technology. Remember, the first paper that was published by Drew Weissman and Katie Carrico in the journal Immunology was in 2005, 15 years before we put the first mRNA vaccine into a person. And the immunogen design that really was done very much by HIV investigators who were using structure-based vaccine design to make an immunogen. That was the science that went into Operation Warp Speed. The enormous amount of money that was put in by the federal government to do the vaccine trials. Remember, we did vaccine trials on tens and tens of thousands of people in a 10, 11-month period. That had never been done before. Now, you put those things together in collaboration with the pharmaceutical companies, it tells me that the next time, hopefully never, but almost invariably we will, the next time we get a challenge like this, we got to do another Operation Warp Speed because it really worked.
Yeah. And then, I think one fascinating piece of this whole thing, which tell me if it's ever been done before, but you had to buy all the doses before you even know if it worked, right? As part of Warp Speed.
So that is what's called, in plain language, Rohan, risk reduction for the pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
Because in the normal course of events, you would never start manufacturing until you knew that the vaccine worked. They started manufacturing when we were doing phase 1. So it was, we are going to assume it's going to work. And that saved literally years. I mean, it did. It saved years. It was a very risky procedure, and the risk was completely on the part of the federal government.
Yeah. At the time, as you're obviously aware, there was a group of folks, some in government now, that were advocating for herd immunity. What did they fundamentally misunderstand about COVID?
I think they misunderstood practically everything about COVID. And you're talking about the Great Barrington Declaration, saying that why don't you sequester the vulnerable people, and then after a couple of months, we'll get herd immunity and only a few people will die. Well, first of all, let's talk conceptually, and then let's talk practically. So from conceptual standpoint, it would be impossible if you understand who the vulnerable people are who wound up dying from COVID. There are about 30 to 40% of the population wind up with some sort of condition. Elderly people. So are you going to take everybody over 75 years old and put them in Madison Square Garden with a couple of beds? I mean, what are you going to do about sequestering people and for how long?
Yeah.
So that thought doesn't make any sense. Secondly, what do you do about multi-generational homes where people live with their grandparents in housing that is very, very crowded? Very, very difficult, because many low and middle income families, particularly minority families, have multi-generational homes. So the idea of sequestering people, all the vulnerable people, would be physically impossible to do.
Yeah.
The second thing, it's then predicated, let the virus rip through society, the unvulnerable people won't get into any trouble, which has been proven to be wrong. Overwhelmingly, it's admitted, the elderly people are much more vulnerable to hospitalization and death. But a lot of people who are not classically the vulnerable people wind up getting in trouble. So the proposal was then, if you wait a couple of months, maybe by April, there'll be herd immunity and you could let all the vulnerable people out from wherever you sequestered them.
Mm.
The trouble is, 6 years have gone by and we still don't have herd immunity.
Yeah.
I'm an example. I've been vaccinated 6 times and I've got infected 3 times. Now, I'm sure at my age, vaccination prevented me from getting seriously ill and maybe dying. But to say that in 2 or 3 months, you're going to have complete protection by herd immunity for the population would never have happened. And it's been proven to this day that it doesn't happen. And then the final thing is that we wound up having multiple variants, which completely negates the issue of herd immunity. So the idea that if you let the virus rip through society, we'll do really well, just unfortunately is incorrect.
Yeah. You know, you just saying something factual like that in public makes you the subject of a lot of personal vitriolic ad hominem attacks. And so I'm curious, how did you deal with that every day for a couple of years? I mean, that must be very
Well,
taxing.
yeah, for 6 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, Rohan, I made a decision that I would do what I felt was important for the public health of the country. And unfortunately, this has triggered, you know, even from my having to publicly disagree with the president, which was very uncomfortable for me. You know, the extremists say that I did it because I wanted to undermine. I'm not a politician. I don't want to undermine anybody. Like I told you from our discussion from the beginning of this discussion, that I'm a physician and I'm a scientist. I'm not a politician. I have no political affiliation. I only did what I did because it was the right thing to do, based on evidence, based on data, and based on science. So when I had to say that the virus would not disappear like magic, which contradicted the president, when I had to say no, ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine doesn't work, which it doesn't, I alienated a lot of people. And given the divisiveness in this country, I became a target of a lot of vitriol. I don't like that, but you know, I wouldn't have done it any other way, because to do it any other way would mean to divert from what's evidence and what's data. And I just feel, you know, getting back to my days at Cornell, when I felt a profound responsibility to the patients I was taking care of on H5 or H4, or wherever it was on the wards, I feel that same responsibility to the American public. Because when you're a public health person, the public is your patient. So, I mean, you've got to, with everything that is of value to you, to tell the truth and to say what you say based on data, evidence, and when the data changes, to change what you say, because science is a process that's self-correcting. And a lot of people don't appreciate that. They say, well, the scientist said this on this month, and then 6 months later, they said something different. Well, it's not flip-flopping, is that we were learning. The pandemic was evolving right before our very eyes. So short answer to your question, I don't like to be the target. I'm sorry that's the case, but it is what it is. I'm not going to walk away from my principles of, integrity in medicine.
I'm curious, because you were the public face of all of these things, in some ways made you an easy target, right? For all these people that wanted to take their theory and use you as a foil. I'm curious, did you ever feel like the broader medical community could be doing something different to help you, looking back?
Sure. The answer is yes. That's an interesting question. Very few people ask that. I can see that in general, the broader population would be reluctant to publicly, with few exceptions. A number of people have very nicely come publicly to me, but I can understand that we're dealing right now in a very threatening situation because the scientific community relies on the government for their funding. And I could understand, even though I wish that wasn't the case, that people are reluctant to publicly get up and defend what they need to defend because it's already been proven when they do, they can be penalized, which is the reason why so many people at the NIH have been fired. I mean, when in your career, and you have a young career like I do, but when in anybody's career, have you seen scientists fired for disagreeing with something, not speaking against it, but just disagreeing? So there's a lot of intimidation going on now against the scientific community and almost a grievance against them, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that whatever the public health emergency is next time, and we're actually dealing with one now with measles as an example, right? That the medical community writ large is really more outspoken than I think we have been. I think we can't just all leave it on you or whoever else the next NIH director or NCI or NIAID director is to kind of solve this problem for us. I think we have to be much more mobilized. But I'm curious, do you agree with that?
I do. I see the only trouble is you're not going to see that because, unfortunately, and I don't want to get into politics, Rohan, I've tried to stay away from that, but the leadership at those agencies now are politically appointed, which was never the case. I mean, all of the program directors and the center directors at the CDC are gone. Half of the institutes at the NIH have acting people, and they've been essentially removed. So there's a considerable degree of intimidation there.
So as we wrap up, I appreciate your time and thank you so much. At a moment when public health and science and the NIH writ large is under strain, what is your impassioned defense of the NIH? Why should the public, rise up to defend it and what it should be?
Well, the NIH as an institution, putting aside what I said about the politicization that's going on right now, which, hopefully is a transient, temporary thing. The NIH is a spectacular institution. It is populated, at least when I was there. It's different now, but the core people on the ground, the scientists who are doing the work, they are a hardworking, devoted group of people who could be on the outside making a lot more money, having a much easier situation of outside activities, but they're devoted to the science. I mean, I was there for 54 and a half years, and these are wonderful, wonderful people. And it's unfortunate that there's been a degree of politicization associated with it now. I hope that returns and you develop the equilibrium of pure science. Right now, there are things that are going on that's not the scientists' fault. The scientists want to do science in an unbridled way. We used to say in the lab, and I'm sure you did, I'll go where the science takes me. Now the word is you could do science, but it has to be aligned with the priorities of the administration. That's not a way to do science. Science needs to be open and free. That's how you make discoveries.
Yeah. Well, amazing. So that's the last big question of the interview. And from here, I just want to transition to a section we called Quick Hits. So book recommendation.
My book recommendations. Well, I knew you were going to say that. So I thought about that. So There are 4 or 5 books that I've read that I really, really like. Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, which really tells you a lot about the evolution of man. The Epic Story of America's Great Migration, if you want to know about that, by Isabel Wilkerson. That's a great book. The River of Doubt, which is Teddy Roosevelt's adventures outside of the presidency. There's an incredible book about the Civil War called The Killer Angels. It's a novel about the Civil War by Michael Shara. And then most recently, Fareed Zakaria, who's the CNN analyst, wrote a book called The Age of Revolution, which is really interesting because he talks about how societies over centuries have undergone revolutions and that we in ourselves are undergoing some sort of a revolution right now in our own society.
Those are great recommendations. I'm going to send you, since you read about the Civil War, a podcast which talks about John Wilkes Booth, who apparently was the George Clooney of his day, and sort of unpacks that whole thing. I think you'd enjoy it. Most impactful mentor?
My most impactful mentor was the person who recruited me from my Cornell residency down to the NIH. His name was Sheldon Wolff. He was an infectious disease person. He was the chief of the Laboratory of Clinical Investigation. And he was the kind of mentor which more of guiding you in the fundamental principles of what you want to do with your career than teaching you a technique in the lab. It was much more the broader 30,000-foot mentorship. He's deceased now, but he was the mentor to a lot of my colleagues at the NIH. Sheldon Wolff, his name was.
And then a leader that you've met that most inspired you and why?
Nelson Mandela. I mean, the idea that this man could spend 27 years in prison, come out, and feel that he could lead the country without any grievances against the people who made his life so difficult. You would never have the country that you have now in South Africa if he came out of prison and would go on a grievance tour of trying to get back at the people. I mean, that is an amazing human being. So he's far and away one of the most inspiring political leaders that I've ever met.
Well, Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your service to the country and to the world. I think we owe you a huge debt of gratitude. So thank you. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Rohan. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Good Medicine. And a special thank you to Dr. Fauci for sharing his perspective. If you're a physician, we'd love for you to join the Roon community at roon.com. That's www.roon.com. You can also help us grow by sharing this podcast with a colleague or friend. Thanks for being part of the conversation.